Hey, Andy.
Hello.
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 This looks like the integrations team meeting.
I was about to say that too.
Thanks, Fabio.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Fabio.
Hello.
I was going to give it just another minute and see if anyone hopped in, but we can go ahead and get started. So I think this is actually our 12th meeting. So thanks everyone who's continued to participate. I think we've got that we've made some good progress. I think there's still a good ways to go. So let's keep up the momentum. I've added some notes in the doc. These are all mine, but you guys can also contribute. Hey, Mike.
Can I have like a, sorry. So can I have like a quick summary of the last 2-3 months, like about the progress of the group, just in 1 minute, you know, like, and then I can go into the details, reading the, you know, the document and issues and all the things, but in 1 minute, like what is the state at the moment of everything?
Yeah, so I'll jump in and hit a highlight or two. I think maybe Fabio and Alex, you guys might want to share as well. I think the main area we've been really focused in is this idea of setting up a wrapper around our GraphQL APIs and really trying to explore POCs with that. So Alex put together a POC for that. Marshall has a second approach as well. So I really think that that's kind of the crux of our next steps, is really vetting that out, trying to understand if that's you know, going to be a valid approach moving forward, which would help us to then kind of alleviate teams in terms of really focusing foremost on the GraphQL API, and then leveraging this REST wrapper to more efficiently contribute.
And just to put some context on that, the reason that this is being approached in the first place was thanks to Grant. Grant did some really good survey work, trying to work out what the consumers and the clients needed. And it's pretty clear that the big conclusion from that is we can't really abandon either of these approaches, REST or GraphQL. We need to support REST for especially for third-party consumers. But on the other hand, we don't want to duplicate all that work internally. So the entire point here is trying to work out how do we continue to support both these as external interfaces while minimizing internal effort on both of those things.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Alex. So yeah, we have done the user survey. We're continuing to have interviews. Sometimes scheduling has been a challenge there, trying to get especially larger enterprise companies pinned down to talk through this. So working on that continuously. And I would really point out, and this is something I was going to touch on today. Let me find the issue. You know, we also try to summarize, I think, or let me put it another way. I have tried to summarize where I'm seeing us going, what the direction is looking like into this API vision prioritization proposal. And what I'm hoping is that we could use this as kind of a discussion issue, you know, make some tweaks and then move it into MR. I was going to ask the question, do I just need to go ahead and move this to an MR and have the discussion there? That might make the most sense, but haven't seen a ton of engagement there yet. But to me, this, I think, breaks down a lot of where we're seeing things from my perspective. So again, I think it does require a little more feedback. I think we are identifying that some of this hinges on how this, what we're calling the raisin POC, how well that will work to solve the problems that we've highlighted. So yeah, anything else that we would point out? Maybe Fabio, I know you've been really engaged.
Yeah, I think you pretty much summarized well, and I'm not sure there is anything else we can add at the moment. I think definitely the next step would be to refine the POC, do some testing and make progress on that, I would say. But that would probably be the biggest kind of chunk of work. Other issues that I remember seeing on the board are more kind of like a smaller aspects and more specific aspects to fix. I think we might need to discuss how we want to tackle those and where do they fit in the roadmap maybe of the vision. But yeah, I think that
there's also been the gap analysis where I'd like to point that was coming out as well. There's been quite a bit of work into that.
Yeah, I will highlight that too. So we've captured feedback. There were a couple of product teams that have contributed to that, especially with Fabio, your help kind of getting it out there. I think on this one, so there should be a link here, to the spreadsheet where we can start to see. Oops, I didn't mean to go new window. So we can start to see, what gaps have been identified that exist today for these groups, and where possible, I've tried to capture, some level of estimation back. So I think a next step on this one is trying to think about how to scale this to share more broadly across the team, or across GitLab. And some of the feedback has been maybe we need to kind of change the approach here and look at what are the patterns and categories, and maybe we can do something more of a survey and some higher level estimation about how much work we think is involved to address that gap, because we may not manually solve each of these gaps. If we're using the Raisin POC, that could change what the effort would be, or there might be some other approaches. So trying to look at this more holistically, I think is where to take this next. But that's something we haven't gotten too much further on yet. But yeah, the feedback we've gotten has been really good. I really appreciate all the teams that participated in that. I think it's just now a matter of kind of putting our heads together and thinking about what does the next step look like for this piece.
Yeah, I think Alex POC on Raisin, it could be, what we need to kind of solve all this gap analysis, because what we notice is like the three main categories. Like one is we have some functionality in REST and we don't have the existing functionality in GraphQL, the vice versa. And in certain cases, we have functionality in both cases, but the implementation differs. And definitely, using the wrapper will definitely improve having that, at least like having all the scenarios where anything that we implement in REST will have automatically something implemented in GraphQL, and we can decide to have the vice versa wherever we want. But for sure, then we can guarantee that the implementation is identical, at least from the logic perspective.
That does remind me of one other point, which I don't think we've fleshed out too much further yet, is this opportunity to add includes, and now I'm just going to blank on the other approach, the other kind of REST kind of implementation that better maps to GraphQL. Includes, and someone help me.
I think it was field set.
Yeah, sparse field sets. Thank you.
Set.
Yeah, so that's something else we were exploring that could make it a little bit easier to support the wrapper and for REST users, rather than having to say like, go use GraphQL. That's going to help you, pull together various resources. Instead, you can use REST to solve that problem, and we just can start supporting field sets and includes in the REST endpoints.
Yeah, I think I remember some compatibility discussions we had, especially around the pagination between the GraphQL and REST. If we want to use the wrapper, are we able to select what pagination style to use? I
mean, pagination. I agree, Fabio. With the pagination is, I think, is arising, is coming forward as the primary area of incompatibility, especially when it comes to replacing existing v4 services, because there's a lot of offset pagination there. If we're looking at moving forwards, we can harmonize and synchronize on key set pagination. But so I don't think I don't think it's a blocker in the future necessarily, but it's definitely would be one of the biggest engineering challenges with trying to replace existing services.
Or if we decide to add new endpoints with the wrapper in V4, we might end up having some endpoints using keyset pagination, some of them using offset. That might be kind of some inconsistency. Was that the discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's definitely going to be an area that if we started doing that, it'll be very confusing for consumers. And I think we'd want to be very deliberate about it.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, I think we covered a lot of the items off the cuff, trying to do a quick review. I'm sure there's a few other items there. And I know, for example, docs is something I wanted to cover, and Katie was going to talk through that here in a minute as well. But does that help, Arturo? Anything else we can catch you up on?
Yeah, no, that's completely fine. More or less, I know that, from the activity that I know what is going on. I think that's, I was getting a very good idea about this. But yeah, glad to see that, that we are starting doing like proof of concepts about really complex things. And I think that this is going to, if we achieve something like this, I think this is going to make a very big impact, So yeah, thank you for the update.
Yeah, very much agree. Thanks, Arturo. Cool. So yeah, maybe, I don't know if anyone took notes somewhere. I wasn't able to keep up with that, but I'll try to go back and add them. The next item I had added here is that I think maybe some of you might be familiar. It's just an issue kind of covering, I think, a really good example case of where we have some inconsistency. In this case, it says API documentation, but I think it's a mix of documentation and our API behavior. So I just want to make sure that everyone was aware of this. I think trying to consider if what we're working on helps to address this, or if this is something new that we need to account for. But there are a number of issues that were highlighted here just as examples of where APIs are not consistent in how we deal with delays or asynchronous tasks. Primarily that we might have created an object and then we say that it's created, but it actually has not gotten created yet. So I think in this discussion, we were talking about, well, we need to use better status codes saying that this is accepted, not that it's been created yet. So I think these are, I think there's a lot of these out here, just trying to narrow them down and really highlight the use cases and think about how do we update our standards? What do we need to also include in our style guides to say this is what we need to consider when we're building our APIs? So yeah, I think this was a really good summary, whereas we have lots of individual issues floating around. Timo is a frequent contributor who pulled these together, and it's a really good summary. So I wanted to highlight that for everyone. And maybe I'll ask the question, is everyone here aware of these cases? And do we feel like we're on a path to help address these? Any actions we can take away from that? I know maybe you haven't had a chance to read through this, but just off the top of your head, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think we probably have a lot of those inconsistencies. And I think, the reason for this is that we don't have a automated documentation. So basically documentation needs to be done by hand. And yes, I think sometimes this is just forgotten when updating API endpoints to also update the documentation. And yeah, I think this could be one reason there are inconsistencies. And if we find a way to automate the documentation, we would probably find many more, I guess.
Good point.
Yeah, well, there's that, and there's also the fact that the kind of things that are being addressed in that issue, I agree, there's a very impressive collection of stuff that states and whether when you return, whether it's created or accepted, or what the what data consistency you can expect. I'm not even sure if we can automate that because, well, involves having to know a lot about the state of the world. I think a lot of that's going to interesting. Well, that I'm glad that's been raised because that's something we really need to have a discussion about as a developer community, or somebody needs to make decisions on in order to decide what we mean by return codes and how we communicate those kind of things to the client, because that's I definitely want to have a look at that issue because that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like to me each team is kind of making their own choice about what makes the most sense, and it's not necessarily always right or wrong. It's about how do we just agree on an approach globally.
Yeah, a lot of this is semantics, and
yeah,
that's stuff that is very hard to tie up with symbols.
Yeah, I think like having even a guideline on what we want as consistency internally will be good. For example, there is sometimes inconsistency between using 404 or 403. Sometimes, do we say something is forbidden or is not found? And like if you don't have access to a project, sometimes we return 404, which makes sense in a lot of cases. But in certain scenarios for permission level, we return forbidden, and in which, like, do we have a clear guideline when to use 404 and when to use forbidden?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I noticed this myself when re-implementing even just a very simple endpoint, just the metadata endpoint, using the GraphQL wrapper. The different access levels and the ability to read the metadata was represented currently in the REST API using 403 permission errors, and in GraphQL we are very consistent about that, but we render permission access errors as null data. So we have even between those two APIs, we have different ways of handling that. At least in GraphQL it's fairly consistent, but it was striking that even in a very small thing with a very little in the way of permissions, there was already disparities that had to be addressed.
Yeah.
Great, cool. Yeah, good points. So yeah, I think we can carry that forward, have some more discussion on it. I know Katie had already jumped in here and maybe a few others. So we'll leave that one there and let's continue discussing the issue. Okay, the next item here, I'd ask Katie just to kind of walk through what she's been working on so far on this issue, and kind of what's your view of the state of things and where we need to go next, Katie?
Sure. Yeah, so I did leave some detailed notes in the agenda, so I'll try not to talk too much because I'm conscious of time. But right at the beginning of this working group, we identified that there were some opportunities to clean up our API style guides, opportunities to clean up some low-hanging fruit, basically, because we noticed a lot of inconsistencies in our API documentation, especially the REST API docs, simply because they are authored by hand and we didn't always have good guidelines about how to write those. So we identified some issues that we could fix up in the style guide, and over the last few milestones, we have been trying to make those fixes. Everything from, just how to document descriptions, how to document responses, how to document version history, deprecations, and so on and so forth. And then the remaining work there is to decide on a few other standardization items, like standardizing on terminology and investigating some more consolidation work, because we seem to have several different pages that call themselves API style guides, and it's not clear what the purpose of each is. So there's some renaming work there and possibly some consolidation work there. So some of the learnings from this is that updating the API documentation style guide has been useful for doing documentation reviews, because it gives you something to point back to, and it has been used. So that has been quite a nice improvement, and so there has been some value in doing that. And also, if we we can also use that to feed into our documentation automation efforts. In that if we have a style guide in place, it can help us to design the automation as well to a certain extent.
Hey, Katie.
Yes.
I had a question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about the API reviews? Kind of what does that look like from your perspective? I'll stop there.
Sorry, the API reviews.
Yes. So you're saying this has been helpful during doc API reviews. So how regularly is that happening, or when does that kind of come up?
Yeah, I was looking for an example before this meeting and I couldn't find it, but it was on an MR that I reviewed recently where there was a question about how to document version history for a particular attribute and how to do it because it was behind a feature flag. And because I'd recently updated the API documentation style guide to include that kind of information, I could then point back to it and say, here are our guidelines for doing that. So I will go back after this and I'll try find that MR and I'll link to it from this agenda just to show that it does help with those kind of things, especially when with the more subjective information. So there's quite a lot that we can achieve through automation, but there is some subjective reasoning we have to apply, and that's where a style guide does come in extremely handy.
Cool. Yeah, and I was asking that because I was wondering, like, when we are making changes to our APIs from a development standpoint, is there like a checkpoint where our developers go do refer to this documentation? Is that built in? So I was wondering if there's maybe an opportunity to utilize our bots for that, to like identify, like, you're touching the API and we're working right now on making these fixes. So like making sure that they see the most recent updates while they're touching the API.
Yeah.
I don't know if maybe that's already done to some extent, but if not, that could be interesting.
Well, for REST API updates, it's treated as any other documentation update because it's part of the docs directory in the GitLab project. So by default, a technical writer will review. So I guess it's also a case of making sure that the technical writing team is aware of our API documentation style guides and are able to apply those rules when they are reviewing API MRs that introduce new API documentation.
Okay. Good point.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sure. And yeah, and also just my last learning or thing that I noticed while doing this is that customers, contributors, in particular Timo again, are very keen to improve our API documentation and are willing to help out. And he's actually made a couple of improvements to our style guide as well, which has been incredibly helpful. Yeah, I would say in terms of the cleanup, we're getting there. We've done a fairly good job of cleaning it up. We obviously now have a significant backlog of documentation that needs to be fixed in order to adhere to the new style guide rules, well, not to the new style guide rules, but to standardize according to it. But that is not something that I think anyone on the technical writing team has got the capacity to handle at the moment. We've considered perhaps opening it up as hackathon issues, because those would be things like go in and fix a bunch of things in the API docs. But other than that, yeah, no clear plan for how to fix the backlog of API docs.
Yep, good note there. Yeah, maybe that's something we can figure out how to crowdsource. And as we start sharing more of this back to other teams, I'll keep that in mind. You know, we've got the API gap analysis. I think this is another opportunity to say, if you want to contribute, here's a place to start doing that. And I like this idea of maybe a hackathon, or I've seen the pajamas day kind of contribution approach. So maybe we could have some API days one of these days. All right, any other questions, comments for Katie?
I think I'm wondering if there is something we can do to even automate some of these tasks. Even if we are going to introduce the wrapper, we probably want the REST version of the endpoints to still be documented in similar places where the current REST documentation is. So we might want to somehow automate part of that documentation. Because at least like in the last year, at least I found at least 2 endpoints that were not documented, and one though that was partially documented. So it definitely is a challenge to keep things in sync since it's all manual work.
Yeah, I agree. The more automation we can do here, the better. I mean, perhaps the lowest hanging fruit is a CI job that looks at all our routes under the API namespace, and then looks in our documentation to ensure that we have examples of at least all of these routes. I mean, that would help us find undocumented endpoints, perhaps, even if it wouldn't write the documentation for us in the first place, which would be the ideal endpoint there.
Yeah,
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. One challenge in that is to find the the documentation is not really linked to a route for an API endpoint. So I think every piece of documentation needs some kind of identifier that maps it to a route in the API. But I think that's a good idea to find the undocumented ones.
Awesome.
Yeah, but I certainly agree that pretty much everything that we can do to improve this is about putting more and more structure into that documentation, and that puts it closer to being automated in general.
Great, good feedback. I'm seeing that we're at almost 9:30, and I guess technically we're supposed to end at 9:25. So maybe I'll pause for a second. I know, Mike, you joined, and you are a newcomer to this meeting, so maybe I'll give you just a few minutes to share, and I'm happy to stay and go through the last bullet here for those who are able.
Thanks, Grant. And for anyone who I haven't met already, Mike LeBeau, Senior Technology Partner Manager on the Alliances team. I've been working closely with Grant over the past, well, ever since he joined GitLab, and appreciate all the work and the effort that the ecosystem engineering team has done for Alliances and our partners. So we're in the process of doing a complete rebuild of our program, looking at how we service our partners, how we classify our partners, and how we can get them to help us drive more revenue for the company. And one idea is, as we tier out the program, kind of think like maybe bronze level, silver, gold type things for our partners, where for silver level partners, we would have a program fee we would charge for, and then we would offer a lot of different go-to-market activities in exchange for that. One of the requirements we're thinking of is making it a requirement that our technology partners integrate with GitLab Premium or Ultimate. So the integration that they're building requires the customer to have Premium or Ultimate, and they're integrating with maybe one of those Ultimate Premium features. And right now we're just kind of ideating and want to confirm the feasibility of this idea. Do we have the API documentation available that we could make this requirement of our partners for all of the, I know that we have like streaming audit events and features like that are ultimate features. Are the docs that we currently have today, would they make this a reasonable requirement to put on our partners or not? That's kind of the question.
I'll jump in first. I mean, I think we all have the goal of having our API features exposed via API. I think that there just are cases where that may not happen. I think that's part of what we're trying to solve for, is to reduce the number of gaps that may exist in our APIs. And in some cases, we may have features in GraphQL that don't exist in REST, or vice versa. So we might have some endpoints that are only exposed in REST and not GraphQL. And so that could be an inhibitor to partners who maybe you're not as familiar or willing to use GraphQL. It's usually not the other way around, but there may be some cases that REST isn't getting the job done, and they need better performance, or for their case they need GraphQL, and that feature may not exist. So there are challenges that we're working to solve, but I think ultimately a lot of the features that we have are reflected through our docs. And then, as we discussed today too, sometimes documentation updates are a little bit may lag behind, so maybe our certain behaviors may not get reflected and stay in sync, and that's something we're trying to solve as well.
Awesome.
Anyone
Thanks,
else want to comment on this? I'm sure I could have missed something. I think one thing that's interesting as well is, like, I guess this depends on the I guess the user has to generate like a no-auth app, or they have to have a user that's calling the API that has these permissions. So maybe the workflow, I'm not sure what the entirety of what you're thinking, how this is going to pan out, how this looks, but there could be some implications involved I'm just not yet familiar with.
Makes sense. Okay. Sounds like initially it's more of a green light.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The APIs are there.
Yeah.
It's just that some features may not be exposed yet, or may be lagging behind, and we'd like to solve that issue moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you, Grant.
You're welcome. All right. Well, I know we're over time at this point, so if anyone needs to leave, feel free. I'll hit on these last few points, and then we can close it out. So, automated documentation. My question here was, as we're thinking about this, is this kind of dependent on where we take things with the Raisin POC? Does this change our approach when we look at automated documentation? Let me stop with that question.
So I think it somewhat depends which approach we take to wrapping. If we do the wrapping in Workhorse, then we would need some, I don't know, but yeah, so let's take a step back. Either way we do the wrapping, we have enough information to generate documentation. If we do the wrapping in Workhorse, then we couldn't share the mechanism for generating documentation between our legacy routes, or however many hundreds of them there are, and any new ones that we add. If we did it in Ruby with the gem, then we can perhaps share some of that implementation by going through things like the Grape Swagger gem, for example. If we can basically push the information through the same place. Either way, we get the information in the same format. Well, we'll have all information. We'll know about the return value. We'll know about the parameters. We'll know about the possible status codes. It's a question of, like, do we want one mechanism for the legacy routes and one for the new routes, or do we want to try and sort of unify them? And I think that's the broad summary.
So how we do it depends on how we do it.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, exactly how we generate the documentation depends on how we generate the APIs.
Right.
Agreed.
Okay. And so I'd ask this question: is this issue still relevant? This is the one that we had kind of checked to say, like, this is the one we're working on. So Andy, you had a comment there. I'll let you vocalize.
Yeah, so this is basically, the issue is basically about putting some automation on our existing REST API documentation. And yeah, I had the discussion with Evan here, and I linked it there. And yeah, I think it's still relevant. And yeah, my plan is to find, like Alex suggested above, to find some yeah, low-hanging fruits where we can add automation without yeah, doing all of the documentation all over again.
So let's start there.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you want to add? I mean, have you run into any challenges with this one yet, or is this still just need to find time is ultimately it?
Yeah, need to find time.
Okay. All right. And then my last question on this was, we've had some requests about how, as contributors, how can a contributor make updates for open API spec? They're kind of waiting on this. A lot of people, I think, are kind of waiting on more automated docs. So is this something that makes sense to put out there? I created an issue. I'd asked Alex, I'd ask some questions your way and kind of capture that in an issue to hopefully be able to share with contributors who want to start working on this now. Does it make sense to push them in this direction? Will this help like to converge at some point, or is this potentially just going to be, you know, reworked and maybe a waste of effort?
Well, it's hard to say at this point. It really depends if we really want to go to open API. I think we probably will do this, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure. And your thinking was that if we ask contributors to work on this and then a few months later throw it all away, that wouldn't be a good experience, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the risk. I think, but I could also see this working as to say, well, we have up to date spec, like an up to date spec sooner, and then once we get the automated docs, we can start to, you know, identify and address the gaps. So like I could see this as something that converges at some point. But you know, from a technical standpoint, I could be missing the point on this. So if it's a lot of wasted effort, I don't want to ask contributors to build something out that we then just kind of wipe away.
Yeah, but I think it's very unlikely that we would wipe it away. I think this will probably be useful in any case.
Okay.
So yeah, I think even if we have automation on our existing documentation, it's probably still useful to have open API. And then at some point we can maybe like, yeah, link them together to make sure it's consistent.
And I certainly have no problem with people starting to write completely, you know, handcrafted open API documentation like we currently have. Like you say, perhaps we'll end up deleting some of it and replacing with automation. As long as it's broadly equivalent, I don't think it's a big problem. The benefit of having a better open API spec would be significant enough, even if some of that work does get deleted in the future, that the benefits of having that spec sooner would be a good thing. So I think I'd be completely fine with it, and it would give us something to target towards when it comes to generation. So I think it's broadly okay.
That's kind of what I was envisioning, and it helps to have that validated. And I think then the last idea here is that we could potentially nurture this issue a bit, add an implementation guide, and be ready to support. And that might, I think, really help us as we're working on the Raisin POC and automated docs, so that we can be aware and kind of bring this all together towards a future point. So I don't know if anyone is willing to raise their hand on that one, but I think this would be a worthwhile place to spend some time. And does anyone want to raise their hand on this call? And this is recorded, so we could also see if someone who hasn't been able to participate as much as those on the call have. It would be great to see someone contributing from our list of attendees. Okay, let's see if anyone can jump in who's watching the recording. All right, and so two more points. I know we're going over time, but this has, I think, been really valuable, so we'll try to hit these quick. I talked about the API vision proposal. This is my view of the world, and I'm sure I'm missing things. So would really appreciate some discussion in there. If this is not the best place to do it, if you want me to move it to an MR and go that route or some other approach, let me know what works best. Pausing for awkward silence.
I think it's an excellent proposal. I apologize for not commenting on it profusely. I'll try and find some time to do that this week. But it looks fantastic.
Great, really appreciate that. Is this the best place to have this?
In an issue? Absolutely, yes.
Cool. All right, great.
Yeah, I'll try to have a look too.
Awesome, thank you. And appreciate any criticism and feedback, whatever you got. All right, and last but not least, Arturo, if you've made it to the end of the call, I don't see everyone's faces.
Arturo had to pop off.
He did have to pop off. All right, so I'll just vocalize for him. I can see that other working groups are tracking percentage of completion and DRIs of each exit criteria. Here's an example. Shall we copy this approach? And to that point, I will say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, Arturo, and it would be great if you can help take the lead on that. Any other feedback or comments to that one? No other opinions. All right. Well, I know we're over again. Really appreciate everyone who hung out and look forward to meeting next time. I think we do have some PTOs and things that may conflict with that. So I might tap someone on the shoulder and see if anyone can help on the facilitation. But yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.